Hi, I'm Ruban Selvanayagam, co-director at Property Solvers. Today, I want to take a closer look at what's just become one of the most consequential housing reforms in a generation, the Renters' Rights Act, which officially became law on the 27th of October 2025. It's been sold as a landmark shift, a long overdue rebalancing of power in favour of tenants, and the final end to what campaigners called the Wild West of private renting. Ministers describe it as fair, modern and compassionate, a way to fix the broken system. But if you strip away the political messaging and look at the numbers, the funding flows, the enforcement structure, and the market incentives, a different picture is emerging. Because the Renters' Rights Act isn't about tenant protection, it's about financial containment, managing housing pressures without increasing public spending. In effect, it turns private landlords into the front line of Britain's housing safety net. Let's dive in. Council finances are under historic pressure. Since 2010, local authority budgets have been hit by one of the longest austerity stretches in modern history. The Institute for Fiscal Studies in 2024 estimates that core local government funding in England is still around 23% lower in real terms than it was 15 years ago. Meanwhile, social care costs have surged by almost a half, leaving little room for anything else. Housing has become the quiet casualty. The National Audit Office found that councils spent £1.74 billion on temporary accommodation last year, up 62% since 2018. Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government data shows that more than 109,000 households are now living in temporary accommodation, the highest since record began. And crucially, over 85% of those placements are in private rented homes or B&Bs, not social housing. That single finger tells you everything, that the private rented sector has become the de facto social housing system. Now, you might think councils could simply build their way out of the problem, but the numbers tell a different story. In 1980, social housing made up about 31% of England's stock. Today, according to the English Housing Survey of 2023 and 2024, it's down to 16%. Each year, we lose roughly 14,000 social rent homes through right-to-buy sales and demolitions. Councils still have legal duties under the Homelessness Reduction Act 2017, but not the homes or budgets to meet them. Now, a few councils are trying to buck the trend. Brighton and Hove, for instance, has approved £50 million to buy 200 homes in what it calls a right-to-buy in reverse programme, an attempt to reduce the soaring cost of temporary accommodation that's swallowing local budgets. Jacob Taylor, the council's deputy leader and finance lead, admitted that spending on emergency housing was pushing the council towards bankruptcy. It's a bold move, but also a rare one. Most authorities don't have the financial headroom to follow suit. Brighton's plan highlights the imbalance. A handful of better resourced councils can buy their way out of the problem, whilst the rest rely on ever stricter regulation of private landlords to contain the same pressures. And that's hardly surprising. The Local Government Association warned in September 2024 that 1 in 5 English councils could run out of money within 5 years without emergency support. Several, Birmingham, Nottingham, Woking, Croydon and Thurrock among them, have already been issued or threatened with Section 114 notices, the local government equivalent of bankruptcy. The Institute for Fiscal Studies in 2024 found that local government funding remains 23 to 25% below 2010 levels in real terms, even as statutory duties like social care and homelessness prevention have expanded. This is the environment that the Renters' Rights Act steps into. On paper, it ends Section 21 no-fault evictions, introduces a national landlord register, and extends the decent home standards to private rentals. Tenants gain new rights to keep pets, to challenge rent hikes, to complain to a single ombudsman. Who could argue with that? But what's missing matters just as much as what's there. There's no dedicated funding for courts to handle the surge in Section 8 possession cases. There's no large-scale investment in social housing to rehouse tenants who fall out of the PRS. And there's no new money for councils now responsible for policing all these rules. So how does it work? Through enforcement economics. Trade press is already reporting councils gearing up for showcase landlord enforcement once the reforms go live, because fines and fees help fund the very teams that issue them. That's not a flaw, it's the business model. Under the Renters' Rights Act 2025, this approach becomes hardwired. Part 6 of the Act, the Enforcement and Local Authority Powers provisions, give councils a statutory duty to enforce private rented sector legislation in their area, not just the discretionary power as before. It builds on the framework first introduced by the Housing and Planning Act 2016, which allowed local authorities to issue civil penalties of up to £30,000 as an alternative to prosecution under the Housing Act of 2004. Barking and Dagenham Council raised £1.3 million in civil penalties last year, covering almost all of its entire enforcement budget. Liverpool, Newham and Nottingham, with large-scale licensing schemes, each make more than £2 million a year from licence fees and penalties combined. The Local Government Association now even calls this a self-funding model. Under the Renters' Rights Act, councils will be granted significantly stronger enforcement powers. Officials can issue civil penalties of up to £40,000 for serious or repeated offences, a rise from the current £30,000 cap. They will also be able to require landlords and agents and others involved in the letting chain to produce documents and information, and councils will have new reporting duties requiring them to publish enforcement activity data. Whilst the exact details of warrantless entry and fixed penalty notice levels such as £7,000 are still subject to secondary regulations, the direction of travel is clear. enforcement becomes more substantial and formalised. In practice, this transforms local housing enforcement into quasi-revenue function. Compliance is no longer simply about housing standards, it's a fiscal mechanism to allow councils to demonstrate results and fund their teams without additional Treasury support. This is arguably the logic behind the Renters' Right Act. Shift the responsibility for housing standards onto private landlords, let councils fund enforcement through penalties, and keep Treasury spending flat. No grants, no new money, just regulation as revenue. Even the government's own paperwork admits the aim. The official impact assessment for the Renters Reform Bill in 2023 said the measures would reduce pressure on local authority homelessness services by improving tenancy stability. That's bureaucratic shorthand for saving money. The less tenants move, the less councils spend. Now, the Act is on the statute book, but the real work and the risk lies in how it's rolled out. The government hasn't yet set an abolition date for Section 21. Ministers know that without serious court reform, the system would seize up. Every eviction would now flow through the courts, and the courts just aren't ready. The Ministry of Justice earlier this year reported that the average time from claim to repossession is 44 weeks, up 47% since 2019. That's almost a year. A landlord with serious rent arrears could wait that long to regain possession while still paying the mortgage, insurance and council tax. That's not a balance, that's attrition. Even supporters of the Act admit the rollout will be gradual. The National Landlord Database, the Ombudsman and the extension of Awab's law to private rentals are all expected to come in phases through the late 2020s and early 2030s. Until those systems exist, court delays will remain the choke point. That delay matters because smaller landlords, those owning 1 to 4 properties, make up 86% of individual landlords according to the English Private Landlord Survey of 2024. They're individuals with mortgages and pensions, not corporations, and they're already under pressure. Buy-to-let mortgage rates sit between 5 and 6%, perhaps less for personally owned properties. But add in Section 24 tax limits, energy efficiency upgrades, and higher insurance premiums, and stacking up the numbers continues to be a challenge. But here's the paradox. Rents are rising, yet returns are falling. The ONS in Q2 2025 shows private rents in England up 8.8% year on year. But those gains are being eaten away by higher financing and compliance costs. For many smaller landlords, what was once a steady income stream now feels like a liability. Rightmove's 2025 data shows rental listings down 41% since 2019, whilst the recent RIC surveys reports the steepest fall in new rental supply since early 2020. And that's where the next shift begins. According to the British Property Foundation and Savills data for Q2 2025, as reported across industry sources, the build-to-rent pipeline stands at around 290,000 homes nationwide, including roughly 135,000 completed, 49,000 under construction, and over 100,000 in planning. Whilst growth has levelled in recent years, the long-term trajectory remains upwards. Now, institutional investors may not love every clause in the Renters' Rights Act, but what they value most is predictability. To be fair, the Act isn't impact-free for them either. Stricter decent home standards, the Ombudsman and annual reporting requirements all add overhead and procedural risk. The legislation creates a more regulated, rule-bound market, one that rewards scale. For them, however, compliance costs and legal frameworks create stability and act as barriers to entry that push out the smaller, less capitalised market players. So when ministers talk about professionalising the PRS, what they really mean is concentrating it. Regulation that filters the market towards the bigger players. And Grainger, the UK's largest listed landlord, all but confirmed it. Its chief executive, Helen Gordon, publicly welcomed the Act, praising the end of no-fault evictions when coupled with court reforms, and crucially, the government's decision to rule out rent controls, calling the package stability for investors. Bigger landlords can live with heavier rules because they're the ones best placed to survive them. But it's also worth looking at where this institutional build-out is happening. According to Centre for Cities, 96% of build-to-rent stock sits in urban locations, and 84% in larger cities. In other words, the institutional wave is concentrated in dense city centre apartments, not the family-sized homes suburban renters actually need. So in a decade or two, Britain's rental market could look less like a network of independent landlords, and more like a handful of dominant institutional operators managing standardised asset for yield. Consistent may be, but at the expense of affordability and diversity. And as smaller owners exit, the balance shifts towards larger portfolio and institutional landlords, who by necessity manage at scale. That means less flexibility and a more impersonal approach to tenants, where decisions are made by compliance teams rather than people who actually know the properties or the families living in them. Who loses first? The most vulnerable, tenants on benefits with pets or thinner credit histories. Landlords will simply tighten criteria, prioritising lower risk tenants. But it doesn't stop there. Risk aversion and the need for financial protection will replace empathy, and the very groups the Act claims to protect find themselves locked out. The middle market, teachers, nurses, blue-collar workers, young families, for instance, also look likely to get squeezed, caught between rising rents and stricter affordability checks. If the real goal was tenant security, we'd see parallel reforms, real investment in social and affordable housing to ease pressure, a properly funded, digitised housing court so possession cases finish in weeks, not months, a sustainable funding model that isn't propped up by fines and fees. But those require money, and that's exactly what this Act avoids. It's cheaper to legislate responsibility onto someone else than to fund it yourself. So what we're seeing isn't housing reform, it's political repositioning, a strategy to manage perception rather than production. The government can say it's standing up for renters, councils can claim new powers, and institutional investors can expand their portfolios, all without the Treasury spending an extra pound. Everyone walks away looking good except the people who actually live and operate in the system. And this is where we have to be honest. Britain's housing crisis isn't caused by a lack of rules, it's caused by a lack of homes. You can't legislate your way out of a supply problem. You can't make renting fairer by making it harder to rent. And you can't keep pushing the burden of social policy onto private landlords without consequences. The Renters' Right Act might fix the optics, but it won't fix the fundamentals. Because ultimately, it's not about tenants, it's about budgets. It's not about fairness, it's about fiscal control. The direction of travel is clear: a smaller, more regulated, more corporatised private rented sector where individual landlords are gradually squeezed out. For councils and the Treasury, that's tidy, predictable, enforceable, measurable. But for renters, it means less choice, higher prices, and a market serving balance sheets rather than people. And that's why when you ask who really wins under the Renters' Right Act, the answer isn't renters, it's the institution, the councils balancing their books, and the policymakers claiming progress without paying for it. The rest of us, SME landlords, tenants, and everyone in between, will be left dealing with the consequences. A big thanks for watching, and if you found this breakdown useful, please don't forget to subscribe for more grounded analysis of what's happening behind UK housing policy, alongside selling and buying homes.